The drums that morning carried only one meaning. The king had chosen a wife. Everyone in the village understood what it meant the moment the sound echoed through the streets. Women stopped their work, men gathered in small groups, children ran from house to house spreading the news. It was a tradition older than memory. Whenever the king desired a new wife, the elders would present the most beautiful girl in the land, and she would be taken to the palace. No girl had ever refused. No family had ever questioned it. People believed the peace of the land depended on obedience. That morning, the royal messengers walked through the village announcing the chosen name. "Hear the king's decree," one messenger shouted loudly. "The great King Igwe Naji has chosen Amarachi, daughter of Okeke, to become his wife and queen." The news spread quickly, and within minutes, people were already rushing toward Amarachi's family compound. Her younger brother Chinedu arrived first, breathing heavily. "Amarachi!" he called. "Something has happened." Amarachi looked up calmly. "Why are you shouting like that?" she asked. Chinedu stared at her as if the words were too heavy to speak. "The king has chosen a wife," he finally said. Amarachi nodded slightly. "Then someone's daughter will enter the palace." Chinedu swallowed. "Yes, but the messengers are calling your name." Amarachi froze. "What?" "They said the king chose you," Chinedu replied. Before she could respond, loud voices approached. The royal messengers arrived with several elders following them. The taller messenger stepped forward and raised his voice again. "Amarachi, daughter of Okeke, step forward and hear the words of the king." Amarachi stood quietly. "I am Amarachi." The messenger nodded. "The king has chosen you as his wife. In 3 days, you will enter the palace and become queen." The crowd erupted with whispers and excitement. Some women smiled with envy, others shook their heads in amazement. Amarachi remained silent for a moment. Then she spoke calmly. "I will not marry the king." The words struck the crowd like thunder. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then voices exploded everywhere. "What did she say?" someone shouted. "Did she just refuse the king?" an elderly woman cried out. One of the elders pushed forward angrily. "Girl, watch your tongue." Amarachi did not move. "I said I will not marry the king." The messenger stared at her in disbelief. "You cannot refuse the king's choice," he said slowly. Amarachi looked directly at him. "I can. My life belongs to me." Her father Okeke rushed forward in panic. "Amarachi, do you understand what you are saying?" he asked in a trembling voice. "You are insulting the throne." Amarachi remained firm. "I am only speaking the truth." The elder woman, Mama Ijeoma, raised her hands in shock. "This girl will bring a curse upon all of us," she cried. "No woman has ever rejected the king." Another elder spoke with anger. "If the chosen wife refuses, the ancestors will be angry with the land." Amarachi's voice did not shake. "Then the ancestors should know that I did not ask to become the king's wife." The messenger's expression darkened. "You have 3 days to reconsider. If you refuse again, the elders will judge you before the whole village." The crowd murmured fearfully. Amarachi folded her arms. "My answer will not change." Just then, another voice spoke from behind the crowd. "Then you should prepare to speak those same words to the king himself." Everyone turned to see Obina, one of the king's trusted guards, standing there with a serious expression. He looked directly at Amarachi. "The king has heard about your refusal, and he wants to see you immediately." Okeke's face turned pale. "Please, she's just a young girl who does not understand what she's doing," he begged. Obina shook his head. "The king does not accept excuses." Amarachi stepped forward before anyone could stop her. "I will go," she said calmly. Chinedu grabbed her arm nervously. "Are you sure about this?" Amarachi took a slow breath. "Yes." Obina watched her closely. "You are walking into the palace of a man who is not used to hearing the word no," he warned. Amarachi looked straight ahead. then today he will hear it again. Obina studied her for a moment, then turned and began walking toward the palace road. Amarachi followed him without hesitation, leaving the crowd whispering behind her. No girl had ever walked toward the king like that before. And inside the palace, the aging king was already waiting, angry, curious, and determined to deal with the only girl who had ever dared to refuse him. By the time Amarachi reached the palace courtyard, word of her refusal had already spread among the guards and palace servants. People whispered as she walked past them. Some looked at her with shock, others with pity. Obina stopped in front of the large palace entrance and turned to face her. His voice was low but serious. "Before you step inside," he said, "think carefully about what you will say. The king is not a man who accepts shame easily." Amarachi looked straight ahead. "I did not come here to shame him," she replied calmly. "I only came to tell the truth." Obina studied her face as if trying to understand where her courage came from. "Many people think bravery is loud," he said quietly, "but sometimes it is simply refusing to be afraid." Amarachi gave a small smile. "Then today I will be very brave." Obina pushed the palace door open and announced loudly, "Amarachi, daughter of Okeke, has arrived." Inside the hall, elders sat quietly in a circle while the king sat on a raised seat watching her carefully. His voice was deep and slow when he finally spoke. "So, you are the girl who believes she can refuse the throne." Amarachi stepped forward and bowed slightly out of respect. "Great king," she said, "I did not mean to offend you." The king's eyes narrowed. "Yet you have done exactly that." The room became silent as the king stood up slowly. "For generations," he continued, "the most beautiful girl in the land becomes the king's wife. It is not only tradition, it is a sacred law that keeps peace in this land." Amarachi lifted her head. "With respect, great king, peace built on fear is not true peace." A loud murmur spread through the elders. One elder shouted, "This girl speaks too boldly." But the king raised his hand for silence. He walked closer to Amarachi and studied her face carefully. "Tell me something," he said. "Why would a poor farmer's daughter refuse a life of power, wealth, and honor?" Amarachi answered without hesitation, "Because none of those things belong to me if I am forced to accept them." The king stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed quietly, though there was no joy in it. "You are different," he said slowly, "but difference can be dangerous." Amarachi did not step back. "So can silence," she replied. The king's expression hardened. "You have one final chance," he said firmly. "Return home. Think carefully. In 3 days, you will stand before the elders. If you still refuse the throne, the council will decide your punishment." One of the elders leaned forward and spoke with warning. "And the punishment for dishonoring the king has never been light." Amarachi felt the weight of every eye in the room, but her voice remained steady. "My answer will still be the same." The king's eyes grew cold. "We shall see," he replied. Obina watched Amarachi as she turned to leave the hall, and for the first time something uneasy crossed his mind. Because if Amarachi truly refused the king before the elders, the entire village might soon face a judgment far worse than anyone expected. 3 days passed quickly, but the tension in the village grew heavier with each sunrise. Everywhere Amarachi walked, people whispered behind her back. Some looked at her with anger, others with worry, and a few with quiet admiration. No one had ever challenged the king's choice before, and the fear of what might happen next filled every conversation. On the morning of the 3rd day, the elders gathered in the village square to hear her final decision. The entire village came to watch. Amarachi stood before them calmly, while her father Okeke sat nearby with his head bowed in shame. Chinedu stood beside him, his eyes fixed nervously on his sister. The eldest of the council, Elder Ngwaka, raised his staff and spoke loudly so everyone could hear. "Amarachi, daughter of Okeke, You were chosen by the king to become his wife. This is a sacred tradition that has protected this land for generations. Today, you must answer clearly before the elders and before the people. Do you accept the king's honor? The crowd held its breath. Amarachi looked around slowly at the many faces staring at her. Then she spoke. I respect the king and the elders of this land, she said calmly, but I cannot marry someone because I am forced to. A loud murmur swept through the crowd immediately. One elder slammed his staff against the ground. You speak as if tradition is a prison, he shouted. Amarachi met his gaze. Tradition should guide people, not trap them. Elder Nwaka leaned forward with a serious expression. Girl, you must understand what your refusal means. The peace of this land depends on obedience to the throne. If you reject the king publicly, the ancestors may punish everyone. Several villagers began shouting angrily. She will bring disaster, someone yelled. The farms will fail, another woman cried. Amarachi listened quietly before answering again. If peace only exists because people are afraid to speak, then it is not peace, it is silence. The elders exchanged worried looks. Elder Nwaka sighed deeply before speaking again. Amarachi, this council will ask you one final time. Think carefully before you answer. The entire square fell silent again. Do you accept the king's choice and agree to become his wife? Amarachi took a slow breath and lifted her head proudly. No, she said clearly. Gasps erupted across the crowd. Some people shouted in anger, while others simply stared in disbelief. Okeke covered his face with both hands as if he could no longer bear the shame. Elder Nwaka closed his eyes briefly before speaking again. Then the council must consider punishment, he declared heavily. At that moment, a familiar voice interrupted from the back of the crowd. Before the elders make their decision, they should hear the truth. Everyone turned in surprise as Ubina stepped forward. The elders frowned immediately. This meeting belongs to the council, one elder warned. Guard, do not interrupt our judgment. But Obina did not move. With respect, he said firmly, this matter concerns the throne itself. The crowd began whispering again as Obina looked directly at the elders. You speak of tradition as if it has always protected this land, but there is something the people do not know. Amarachi watched him carefully, confused by his sudden courage. Elder Nwaka's voice grew tense. Be careful with your words, young man. Obina did not look away. The reason the king must marry the most beautiful girl every generation is not because of the ancestors. The square grew dangerously quiet. Obina finished his sentence slowly. It is because of a secret the throne has been hiding for many years. The elders' faces changed immediately, and Amarachi suddenly realized that her refusal had uncovered something far bigger than anyone expected. The entire square fell into a deep silence after Obina's words. Even the elders looked shaken. Elder Nwaka rose slowly to his feet, gripping his staff tightly. Young man, he said with controlled anger, you are standing before the council of elders. Choose your next words very carefully. But Obina did not step back. His voice remained steady. I am choosing them carefully, he replied. The people deserve to know the truth. The villagers leaned closer, their curiosity overpowering their fear. Amarachi watched him with confusion. She had expected the elders to punish her, not to hear a secret that could shake the throne itself. One of the elders pointed at Obina sharply. You forget yourself. The king trusted you as a guard, not as a storyteller. But Obina shook his head. This is not a story. He turned to face the villagers. For many generations, the people have been told that the king must marry the most beautiful girl to keep peace in the land. You are told that the ancestors demanded it. Murmurs spread through the crowd. But that is not the full truth, Obina continued. The real reason the king chooses a new wife every generation is because the throne fears losing power. The elders immediately shouted in protest. Enough, one of them roared. You are speaking dangerous lies. Obina looked directly at them. If it is a lie, then explain why the chosen wives disappear after some years. The square exploded with shocked whispers. Amarachi's eyes widened. "Disappear?" she repeated quietly. Several villagers began murmuring among themselves. "My grandmother once spoke about that," someone whispered. "Yes, some queens were never seen again," another voice added nervously. Elder Nyaka raised his voice again to silence the crowd. "Those women entered the palace and lived as queens. That is all the people need to know." But Obina's expression remained firm. "No," he said, "it is not all." Amarachi stepped closer to him. "What are you saying?" she asked quietly. Obina looked at her carefully before answering. "The truth is that some of those women were never meant to rule beside the king," he said. "They were only meant to strengthen his authority." The crowd grew restless. One elder shouted angrily, "Guards, remove this man immediately." But before anyone could move, a powerful voice echoed across the square. "No one will touch him." Everyone turned toward the palace road. King Igwe Naji was standing there, surrounded by royal guards. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp. Slowly, he walked toward the center of the gathering while the crowd parted for him. The elders bowed quickly. Amarachi remained standing. The king stopped a few steps away from Obina and looked at him carefully. "You have served me for many years," the king said quietly. "Yet today you speak against the throne." Obina lowered his head slightly. "I speak for the truth." The king turned his gaze toward Amarachi. "And all of this began because of you," he said slowly. Amarachi did not look away. "All I did was refuse something that was forced on me." The king studied her face for a long moment before speaking again. "You have caused more trouble in 3 days than any person in this land has caused in 30 years. The crowd held its breath as the king continued speaking. "Very well," he said finally. "If the people want the truth, they shall hear it." The elders looked shocked. "Your Majesty," one of them began nervously, but the king raised his hand for silence. His voice became cold and serious. "This tradition exists because every king must prove his control over the land. A throne without fear is a throne that soon falls." The crowd gasped quietly. Amarachi felt a strange chill run through her body. The king looked directly at her again. "But you have done something no one has ever done," he continued slowly. "You refused." He paused for a moment, then spoke the words that made the entire village uneasy. "And now, the land must decide something it has never decided before." Amarachi felt her heart beat faster, because whatever decision the king was about to make would change everything. The square remained silent after the king's words. Everyone waited to hear what would happen next. The elders looked nervous. The villagers whispered quietly, and Amarachi stood calmly in the center of it all. King Igwe Naji slowly turned to face the people. "For many generations," he said, "this land has followed the same tradition without question. The throne chooses a wife, and the people accept it. That obedience has kept the kingdom strong." He paused and looked toward Amarachi again. "But this girl has challenged that tradition openly. She refused the throne in front of everyone." One of the elders quickly stepped forward. "Your Majesty, we should punish her before the people begin to believe that disobedience is allowed," he said urgently. Some villagers nodded in agreement, while others remained silent. The king raised his hand for quiet. "Punishment may silence one voice," he said slowly, "but it will not stop the questions she has raised." Amarachi watched him carefully, unsure of what he would do next. The king then turned toward the crowd and spoke loudly so everyone could hear. "Today, the land must make a choice. Should tradition rule people, or should people choose their own path?" The question shocked everyone. No king had ever asked the people for such a decision. The elders looked uncomfortable. One of them spoke quickly. "Your Majesty, this is dangerous. If the people begin questioning tradition, the authority of the throne may weaken." But the king only gave a small smile. "Authority that survives only through fear is already weak," he replied calmly. He then looked at Amarachi again. "You said your life belongs to you," he continued. "Tell the people one last time. Do you still refuse to marry the king?" Amarachi took a deep breath and spoke clearly. "Yes, great king, I refuse." The crowd murmured again, but this time the anger was softer. Some people looked thoughtful, others looked at Amarachi with quiet respect. Chinedu stepped forward suddenly. "My sister should not be punished for speaking the truth," he said bravely. Okeke looked shocked by his son's courage, but slowly nodded in agreement. Another voice came from the crowd. "She is right," a woman said. "No girl should be forced into marriage." Soon, more voices joined. "Yes," someone shouted. "Let people choose their own lives." The square slowly filled with agreement. The elders exchanged worried glances, realizing the mood of the people had changed. The king watched the crowd carefully before speaking again. "It seems the land has already made its decision," he said quietly. Then he turned to Amarachi and gave a small nod. "You are free." A loud wave of surprise and relief spread through the crowd. The king continued speaking, his voice firm but calm. "From this day forward, no woman will be forced to marry the king against her will. The throne will not take freedom from the people it rules." The elders looked shocked, but none of them dared to argue. Amarachi bowed respectfully. "Thank you, great king," she said softly. The king looked at her for a long moment before replying, "Do not thank me. Thank your courage." As the gathering slowly began to disperse, Obina walked beside Amarachi. "You changed something that people fear to challenge for generations," he said. Amarachi smiled gently. "Sometimes change begins with one simple word," she replied. Obina nodded. "No." Amarachi laughed quietly. "Exactly." The sun slowly rose higher as the people returned to their homes, carrying a new understanding with them. For the first time in the history of the land, a girl had refused the king, and instead of bringing a curse, she had brought freedom. The moral lesson in this story is that true courage is not fighting with strength, but standing for what is right, even when you stand alone. One brave voice can open the door to freedom for many others. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more interesting stories. Thank you for watching. See you in my next story.